This episode is part of the EUTERPE Podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective.
Hello everyone, I'm your host Uthara Geetha. Today on the podcast, we have with us Professor Birgit M. Kaiser. Dr. Birgit M. Kaiser is Professor of Comparative Literature at Utrecht University. She holds a BA and MA in Sociology from Bielefeld University and a PhD in Comparative Literature from New York University. Birgit's research spans literatures in English, French, and German from the 19th to the 21st centuries, always with a focus on literature as a mode of poetic knowledge production. Her specific research interests are the relation of nature and philosophy, theories of subjectivity, the history of aesthetics and affect, multilingualism in literature, as well as post- and decolonial literary critique. Birgit also works on changing forms of critique and criticality in the 21st century, as well as contemporary methods of reading. Today, on the podcast, we will be extensively discussing her second monograph, Hélène Cixous' Poets of Voice, Eco, Subjectivity, Diffraction. Hi Birgit, and happy to have you on our podcast. Could you tell us about your research interest and how that led to this book of yours?
My research interests have always been in what is the subject, I think. What is a being human? And I've always been very distrustful of the conventional story of the body and mind being split. So I've always really been interested in the material, in the bodily, in the corporeal, in affect and emotion, and how does that contribute to the making of a subject. So that goes way back to my own PhD, and then I used to study sociology.
Okay.
So that's my first training, and I was and have always been really interested in, so if I say in the subject, but always in a social being.
Yeah. In
the subject as a social being, as a material social being. And then I switched to literature because I like to think about the myths, maybe, underlying our ideas of the social and our ideas of the individual and our ideas of human beings. And I found the methods in sociology interesting, but not interesting enough. So I find literature a fantastic source of myth-making. And if I say myth-making, then I think that's always something that translates into world-making. So we could think with Sylvia Wynter and Frantz Fanon, who say that myths are deeply informative of the way the social is structured. So in that sense, I'm always very interested in literature being a form of thinking about quasi-philosophical. And in my case, most interested in the thinking about what do material, social, corporeal existences look like, and how does a subject form under those conditions.
Okay.
I've done this in various forms, and this book now is the latest form of that.
That's wonderful. And linking it to your PhD and your research interests, you talked about myth-making, and you can see that in your latest book. You start with Echo in Cixous' work. So how did you pick her as the author, or did she come to you in other works and then you moved?
Well, she came to me very true to Cixous' own idea of how writing comes to her, because she's always visited by ghosts, images, words. So the books come to her, she says. In that sense, I feel this book also came to me. All books, sort of. I agree with her. I think books come your way.
Yeah.
You don't consciously, fully, agentially choose them. So this. One starting point was 2010, when I was invited to a summer school, actually in Granada, on the 1968, on the idea of revolution, 1968-1989, and I should pick a writer.
Okay.
And something in me came across a book, and I was reading that book, and I thought this is absolutely fantastic, because it echoed then with readings I was doing in New Materialism.
Can I ask which book?
I started with Root Prints,
Okay.
Memories and Life Writing, which is really an interview with her, long interview, where she reflects on how she writes and what she thinks about many things. And I thought everything that she describes there resonated so well with, I was reading Karen Barad at the time, and I thought, this is really eerie. I see so many resonances. So I always said, well, in a way, it started 2010 when I was invited to this lecture. For some reason, I picked this book, and there it started. But then a friend reminded me that we had already been reading Cixous in the 90s.
Oh,
which I had forgotten. So, it must be some deep,
it's interesting.
Something. Yeah.
So in the introduction you've written to the book, you mentioned that your book is not about Cixous, but rather an attempt to think with her. So would you describe this diffractive approach you have taken to Cixous as your chosen methodology, or is it just for her? You have chosen this methodology, or is it there in your other works?
It's there in my other works, but I think you're asking what came first in a way, and I would say nothing came first. Everything came at the same time. Very much in line with what I'm trying to say about echo in Cixous' work. So I think, like I said, I was reading two things at the same time. Karen Barad's Meeting the Universe Halfway and the Root Prints Memories and Life Writing by Cixous, and somehow they worked together for me really well. So my interest in diffraction was there because it came out of an interest in the materiality into the agential materiality of the world, in diffraction as a then very refreshing proposition of thinking difference as generated, as differentiating, as very material, and Cixous spoke to that. So in that sense, I think they came at the same time. But also, I would say this particular oeuvre, or whatever, body of works, functions, I would say cannot be written about, because about would mean that I have read it all, and that I am now taking a step back, and that I survey the whole land, and then I can write about it. And there is just too much text, and it's too interconnected. Things from the 60s to today, 70 books, 80 books, over, 150, 200 texts in total, that I can't manage to stand outside and look at it, to write about it. So I don't have the control for an about. But I can think with it. And in a way, that's also, of course, it's also a statement on what I think reading does. That one, I find the most productive reading is one where I don't pass judgment on the writer, whether this, or say something, make a definition, give a definition of what a writer does or doesn't. So classical critique, classical critical writing, but rather I find for me the most productive way of working is that I think with the people I read, that they guide me in my own thinking, and that sometimes I am, maybe that is the case for this book, I'm a bit unfaithful. I'm not that interested whether I'm correct.
Okay.
But I'm more interested in whether something interesting happens in the reading. Spivak makes an argument about this in Fanon's reading of Hegel, where she says he's not interested whether he's that right. There might be Hegelians saying, you got it all wrong. I don't care. I will use what Hegel gives me, and I will use it for my own purposes.
So could you expand on the classical critique and how you critique? So you kind of partially explained it, but how does it look as a researcher to do that?
Well, the classical would be exegesis of text. Classical in literary studies, exegesis of text, interpretation. So I study an author and I more or less explain what happens in that author. Assume that my interpretation is sort of a correct harvesting of the meaning of that text. Now that model of critique has been criticized for a long time. among others by Derek Attridge, for example, and his point of reading being and also the whole tradition of deconstruction, which Derek Attridge, of course, is situated within, which Cixous is situated within, Jacques Derrida is situated within, to say reading is a performance. Mm-hmm. So reading itself is a performative act. It brings something out. It's not interpreting meaning that is situated in a text, but it's actually the act of meaning production itself. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I would say I'm not critical in the classical sense of interpretation or exegesis. I am an active reader, so my readings are productive of meaning rather than finding meaning in the maybe the diffractive approach is a bit of an extra twist. Because that's also why I said unfaithful, because in a way I am reading Cixous together with thinkers whom she is not engaging with. Mm-hmm. So I did the same in my dissertation actually. So the classical response to that in my dissertation, I was reading Heinrich von Kleist and Herman Melville together, and the classical response, which I was struggling with to get my dissertation approved, was to say these people have not written on each other, they never met, there is no influence between them. How can you bring them together? Mm-hmm. So the same would apply here. I'm bringing her together with thinkers or writers she has not engaged with. She is not engaged with Barrage, she's not engaged with Kirby, she's not engaged with Trin. So it would be a little bit surprising maybe that I join her with these thinkers. She has no relation of influence. So classically, the classical tradition of literary critique would say, well, you have to be able to trace some sort of historical connection between the people that you compare or that you bring together. So I'm not comparing, I'm diffracting.
When reading your book, a diffractive approach felt like the natural way to engage with Cixous' work. And now I'm wondering, would a more traditional reading offer different insights into the contemporary moment, or would it make her work feel less current?
Absolutely, of course. Many people have done it in different ways. Let's say why. So one can always apply different interests, of course, to text. So you could read her for all sorts of things. Why I have chosen this is precisely because, and this maybe also get us to the feminine and the ecological, is because my key point with this book is to say, I think we have someone here who has a really profound contribution which is contemporarily super relevant to thinking about subjectivity. And we haven't heard it enough because it's in the form of poetic fiction. Yeah. So I needed these other thinkers for myself in the course of writing it to articulate what I think Cixous' wonderful point is on what would an ecological, what she calls a feminine, but what I call ecological, what would an ecological mode of being a subject, becoming a subject look like. I think that's super relevant. I mean, it's always been super relevant, I guess, but it's maybe particularly relevant today because it offers thinking about relations to otherness. It, I think, offers very much a post-colonial or decolonial attentiveness to the ways in which we become, where we're situated. It is very attentive to the human as within ecologies of more than human. So I think all of that hasn't really been brought to the forefront because she has been read in a certain way. That has to do with how her work has been translated into English, how it has been received as part of new French feminism in the 80s, and that performance that I see across her work of echo hasn't been heard. I mean, this may be megalomaniac, but I think that's a dimension of her writing that hasn't been seen enough. So that's the real motivation for this work. And I couldn't do it without my diffractive approach and my other thinkers to think with.
Before moving on to the next question, I would like to quote you from your book. Quotes, "It is precisely in her poetic fictions that Cixous puts the entanglement of language and materiality to work. And it is from this material semiotic starting point that she explores the processual emergence of selfhood, the process of subjectivation as voice. For Cixous, such a process is material and linguistic, and the voice that emerges is always heterogeneous, foundationally relational with others, and never closed in on itself. Accordingly, in Root Prints, Memory and Life writing, Cixous notes that for her, being human means not depriving oneself of the rest of the universe. Being human means to echo a complex but magnificent labor with what constitutes the universe, and to reiterate, it is across her poetic fictions that this magnificent labor crystallizes, it takes shape over the course of her writing. To gauge Cixous' specific proposition for thinking of subjectivity as emergence of voice, a voice that always echoes with the universe, one must therefore also trace this emergence across the span of her corpus." Colston. What would be lost if her arguments were separated from the literary form in which they were embedded?
Well, like I said in the beginning, the connection of literature and philosophy, or literature as philosophy, has always really interested me. Theory is already a very contemporary term, it's a post-60s term, for some kind of philosophy. So classically, philosophy has, it's a tradition of asking questions, philosophizing about abstract concepts, and it has been a domain that has traditionally set itself apart from the literary. And literature as a domain, the way we treat it today, it came up roughly around 1800 in the Western context. As this fiction writing that is entertainment, that is imaginative, fictive, poetic, but that is not understood as production of thought. So they have excluded each other a little bit, philosophy and literature. And theory came up as a concept already to mess with that distinction a little. But I treat literature without, I hope, forgetting about the fact that it is aesthetic, that it's poetic, that it is rhetorical, that it is also entertainment, that it's fiction, without forgetting about all its fabulous qualities. I think in the way it performs what it does, it offers thought. I've made the same argument in my dissertation. I think literature offers a particular way of thinking that philosophy, for reasons of the history of these disciplines, hasn't been able to ask. Derrida makes the same argument, Foucault makes the same argument, so I didn't invent this. But that's my investment in literature as theory.
Okay.
But it's perhaps a bit tricky to hear that, because we're so trained to read the literary as fictive and entertaining. So it needs a little extra attentive ears, I think, to hear to see what is the thought that this offers.
Moving on to your book, could you please tell us what Cixous means by feminine writing in her books?
Yes. Many people have thought about this and talked about this. So she used the term feminine writing, écriture féminine, in her texts of the 1970s. She was not the only one to talk about feminine writing, but she very prominently and very creatively used the term In the Laugh of the Medusa, which is sort of the text that she's canonized for. Many people have read The Laugh of the Medusa, which is from 1975. And perhaps people have read the companion piece that she wrote in the same year called Sortie, which is an extended version of The Laugh of the Medusa, basically. And these have been anthologized and they've been translated, and many students of feminist theory and history and gender studies have read The Laugh of the Medusa. And that's where she coined the term and sort of performed it also a little bit, écriture féminine. Nobody's really read, other than Cixous fans, the poetic fictions. So that's one point to say, well, actually, she uses the term écriture féminine in these two kind of theoretical texts, but they're quite wild. They're not theory. But she performs écriture féminine in her poetic writings, which started in 1967, and she's done a book a year or 2 books a year. So this whole development of a poetic fiction is actually the performance of écriture féminine. Now what happened is that the text got translated into English. It's always the language that makes things circulate more widely. And it was translated as women's writing. So the first sentence in French is Je parlerai de l'écriture féminine. And the English translation says I shall speak about women's writing. So féminine gets translated as women's.
Women's, okay.
Which was great, and people loved it, and it was about, the 70s and women reinventing themselves and anti-patriarchal critique and all that. But what happened then is that it became understood as a woman's writing. And it got criticized then in the second step very much for an essentialist perspective, especially because in the Laugh of the Medusa, she talks a lot about the body and the materiality of existence, and that bodies need to write, and she has a very material understanding of writing. It is the poetic writing, which she does by hand, but it's also really the body writing itself. Now, in the 80s, everybody was confused and said, this is some weird essentialism. We're tying women back to their bodies. We've just tried to escape the naturalization of women as uterus. We want to get away from that. And this weirdly ties us back to it. So that's why I think much of the circulation was cut short, because she got the label of essentialism. And I think it's precisely not essentialism. It's the very agentiality of matter and corporeality that she talks about. Now she calls it féminine. She also says that's for better or for worse. She continues to talk about this bodily writing as féminine, because she's trying to work on basically on what has been said about women and the feminine, and to rethink it, and that comes very much from psychoanalysis. So she says, I'm inheriting a territory from Freud, where there are particular ways of the feminine that are thought in particular ways, and that's what I want to unwork. So I'll stay with the term to unwork Freud's fixing of the feminine. But to me, it feels like it might be more audible today to readers. It may, if we get rid of that baggage, and rather call it ecological.
Okay.
Because actually that's what it does, I think. It's very much a logic of echo, of being with ghosts of many others, past others, ancestors, future others, animal others, myself as other, in ecologies of living, very material, very situated. And we might be able to hear this more today if we think of it as ecological. Now you don't hear the H, but there's an H in there. Then the feminine.
You discussed this in the introduction to your book. I would like to quote a few sentences from page 20. Quotes. In Root Prints, Cixous notes that she proposed the term feminine writing in the 1970s as a strategic intervention into the feminist struggles of those years. Surely, in 1975, it was an urgent move to reclaim sexual difference, the feminine and women's body. It was crucial to insist on the right of the feminine to be valued and for women to be endowed with rights, including the right to be different from patriarchal ascriptions and from its assumptions of what women want, a question that Freud and after Freud, Lacan raised only to leave it unanswered. Quotes done. And then you explain what Cixous actually means by feminine. Quotes. Cixous employs the adjective feminine to designate a particular management of drives and desires. Feminine, she notes, characterizes a more adventurous mode of living, more on the side of spending, riskier on the side of the body. This does not mean that only women or female bodies are capable of such a different management of desires and selfhood. Quotes done.
Because she says also, and she says it right in the 70s already, but nobody heard it. What I'm trying to do is get us away from the masculine-feminine binary. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to get rid of that binary opposition, but I'm still hanging on to the term feminine to rewrite what that means. And it's not for women only. She's really strong about this. She says it has nothing to do with women's bodies. But at the same time, of course, one has to say that in the 70s, she was, and many other feminists were, of course, also thinking about womanhood, femininity, in its own right, because it had been so captured by myths of patriarchy. So it's two things at the same time. It's a complicated operation, so I thought actually ecological might help us air this a little, clear some of the complications.
Okay. So this is a doubt I just had. Could you describe Cixous' stand as strategic essentialism or not?
No.
Or no?
No, I don't think so. No. Also strategic essentialism, no, because I think it's a radical de-essentialism. And strategic essentialism, Spivak, is with the understanding that that essences are a complicated thing, to still create the possibility for a political insistence on some identitarian politics for the sake of political force. No, I think this is really, it's the performance of, and we could talk about what type of politics can we do with that thinking. That's maybe a different question, but it's definitely a performance of a corporeal, a bodily, an affective, a material living that we are, non-separable from all other material living. So there is no essence to a body, but we all become in that sort of entanglement and interaction and situatedness. And we create our own voices. That's why I call it voice. What is it? Hélène Cixous' Poetics of Voice. Echo, subjectivity, diffraction. Because I think it is a totally anti-essentialist.
Yeah.
But on that ground of, it thinks material, body, and mind is body, and language is material, as a generation, as a production of a voice. So I think
it's a different way of reintegrating body into the thought.
I think so. But she would say, I don't like reintegrate because it's never been separated.
Makes sense, yes. So when we talk about echo, how would you trace the evolution of echo as a myth from which she starts her works, and how she handles it, and how you have reached ecology?
Yes, okay, lots of questions. It will take 2 hours. Well, like I said with the feminine, when she said feminine is part of the Freudian territory, and that's what I inherit she very much works or tries to insert herself critically into what she inherits. Mm-hmm. And one of the traditions, again through psychoanalysis, that she inherits is a particular story of echo. So echo comes, I talk about this also in the introduction, echo comes, comes from the Western canon. It's comes up in the third book of Ovid's Metamorphoses. So text from European antiquity. And it's become, as Ovid's Metamorphoses have been sort of a source of medieval storytelling, and it's ultimately been picked up for Cixous' context very powerfully by Freud, Sigmund Freud, in his reading, because he read a lot of Greek and Latin texts, myths, like Oedipus, for example. But he read also the Echo Narcissus story. So Echo's story in Ovid is the story of Echo and Narcissus. Mm-hmm. And Freud particularly took the figure of Narcissus as a figure of self-love, primary narcissism. So that helped him really think about the ego as sort of a self-reflexive and sort of narcissistic operation. Now, over the course of that, Echo was always the other of Narcissus. Mm-hmm. And she was also seen as someone, which is true in the myth, who loses her her control over her voice. She's punished by the gods because she's a really crafty storyteller. She keeps Juno entertained while her divine husband Jupiter is having fun with other nymphs. Mm-hmm. So Juno punishes her and takes away her agency over her speech. So she can only repeat what others have said. Mm-hmm. And then she meets Narcissus, and there's a whole misunderstanding on Narcissus' side, because she can only repeat what he says. So he gets it all confused, and he's anyway in love with his own reflection in the lake. And she dies of a broken heart and basically withers away, and all that remains of her is her voice. So she's seen as somebody who's, not very attractive as a subject, mm-hmm. withering, not in control of her speech, etc. But what happens, I think, in Freud, what Cixous does in the 70s is to say, the premises if we think about the feminine, or if we think about sexuality in general, the premises that you set are masculine. Mm-hmm. You think through Narcissus, you have, and various other accounts, sort of Freud thinks about masculine sexuality, and the derivative of that is feminine sexuality. Mm-hmm. And he says at some point, I can't say much about that. We don't know what woman wants. Of course, there's been many also feminist psychoanalysts and many traditions. I'm mainly focusing on Freud because Cixous also focuses on Freud, and mm-hmm. it's been through Lacan and the Freud reception in France, been a really strong psychoanalytic tradition. So feminine sexuality is literally, Freud says that, the dark continent. Mm. We don't know what she wants. She's all over the place. And she definitely, according to Freud, also the boys' logic is sort of starting from, it's all very complicated. You can read it in chapter 3, my book. Yes. But it centers ultimately around the penis, mm-hmm. and the anxiety of castration. Mm-hmm. So on the boy's side, he's really worried to be castrated because the mother has a different body, and he's worried that he's going to lose his penis. Mm-hmm. And on the girl's side, Freud assumes that she's so envious of the penis. So and Cixous in the 70s, in The Love of the Medusa, says, Medusa's another Freud reading that she does, she laughs at this and she says, what are these premises? If you start from there, you assume that this is what everybody's worried about, the penis. Either having it or not having it, or... then you might come up with these narratives, but that's a starting point that I might not Bye.
Let me read out an excerpt from The Laugh of Medusa as published on Science. Quotes. Besides, isn't it evident that penis gets around in my text? That I give it a place and an appeal? Of course I do. I want all. I want all of me with all of him. Why should I deprive myself of a part of us? I want all of us. Woman, of course, has a desire for a loving desire, not a jealous one. But not because she's jilted, not because she's deprived and needs to be filled out, like some wounded person who wants to console herself or seek vengeance. I don't want a penis to decorate my body with, but I do desire the other for the other, whole and entire, male or female, because living means wanting everything that is, everything that lives, and wanting it alive. Castration? Let others toy with that. What's a desire originating from lack?
But what she does is that's my suggestion, that she takes Echo as this forgotten figure, which is actually not a forgotten figure, which can very well be an articulation of its own, but which works differently from the whole narcissistic, self-involved idea of self.
Okay.
Because Echo, if you read the Ovid story, Echo there's a strong desire in Echo for the other. Mm-hmm. She really desires Narcissus. I mean, he misses it all, but she sort of really desires him. And she starts from the other. So the other is always there as a reason of being, as a living other. That's very important for Cixous, because the other is there in Hegel and in Freud, but especially in Hegel, it's a dead other. Mm-hmm. So, the self becomes the self when the other has become nothing but a serviceable sort of vehicle for the self. So the other is metaphorically or actually, but there's always a dead other. And Cixous and Echo try to think about the living other. So how do you live with others? These others are actually also, they make claims on you. They ask you to respond. There are many others. You necessarily don't understand what they want, who they are. So this multitude of others that Echo allows her to bring in, I think that's one of the key propositions. And with that, in a way, she boldly ditches. She does that pretty explicitly in The Laugh of the Medusa and Sortie. Hegel, who is one of the towering figures of the 19th century philosophy, the self-other dialectic. So she side-passes that. She laughs at that as well. And psychoanalysis. So phenomenology and psychoanalysis, major traditions, to say, actually, I have a different... if we start from a different starting point and stop worrying about castration anxiety as the main driver, we might get somewhere else.
Okay.
That's a move. That's a big move.
That's a very big move.
Let us end the first part of the podcast here with another quote from The Laugh of the Medusa. Quotes. It's up to you to break the old circuits, to consider the launching of a brand new subject to life with defamiliarization. Let us dematter-paternalize rather than deny woman. Let's get away from the dialectic which has it that the only good father is a dead one, or that the child is the death of his parents. We are fed up with the litany of castration that's handed down and genealogized. We won't advance backward anymore. Oral drive, anal drive, vocal drive, all these drives are our strengths, and among them is a gestation drive. Just like the desire to write, a desire to live self from within. Quotes closed. Here our second part for more on Cixous about the self and its plurality, ecology, and much more. Thank you for listening to this EUTERPE podcast.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.